What is up, everybody? We have good friend and hunter extraordinaire, as I like to say, Mr. Remi Warren here at Vortex HQ. Now, right now, Remi, spring bear season is underway, right?
It is.
It is cranking. But,
Yep.
maybe some folks, maybe they can't get out. Maybe they're going to hunt hard all spring. They're not going to notch that tag. And they're in that situation where it's the latter part of that spring bear season. So I think that's what we're going to talk about today is kind of those late season spring bear tactics and maybe some tips and tricks that might help some folks punch that tag and things they need to consider as that season progresses.
For sure, yeah. So I'd consider maybe a late season spring bear hunt is last week of May, but primarily June.
Okay.
So there are a few places where that season goes into June, maybe the first couple weeks of June. Idaho actually has some seasons that go toward the end of June.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd consider it then. And the interesting thing, the different thing about late season is you've got all the other bear tactics you can use, but they're also in their breeding season.
Mm-hmm.
So boars are going to be moving more for sows, and that's going to kind of change the tactics a little bit. One of the things that I switch up is, another thing, later in the season, you run into other problems as well, right? When you're hunting early season, not a lot of foliage has bloomed.
Right.
Now you're looking for bears when the grass is tall and every tree has leaves.
Right.
So it makes it more difficult to spot them. And I actually tend to focus on areas that have more open that time of year because my glassing's more effective and they are moving around more. They'll catch the scent of a sow. They'll be moving around. They'll be cruising more, trying to find females to breed.
Gotcha. What about food? Oftentimes when we talk about bears, we're like, oh man, they're a slave to their stomach, whatever the bears are keen on. But early in the spring season, there's like, oh yeah, I found these limited pockets of like the best grass perhaps or something like that. Later in the season, there's grass everywhere. The roads are filled with grass. The hills are filled with grass. There's, things are just more abundant. The dandelions are completely popping. Are there any things that a person can still key in on when there's that much green up?
Yeah, there's a few things. So, bears they eat a lot and they need a lot of energy. And what they are is they're very selective eaters. And a lot of people don't realize how selective a bear is.
Okay.
So what they're looking for is they're looking for the most nutrient, like the biggest bang for their buck, right? So there might be a lot of grass, but maybe a lot of that grass is almost like dead filler weight. Whereas it's that first growth of grass that's the most nutritious. It's that bud of the tree. It's that bud of whatever's growing has 10 times the amount of nutrients as something that maybe is a little more mature. One thing that bears will kind of transition to as it gets later in the spring season is I find them on like a lot more root feed, like tubers and other things.
Okay.
So that's something to think about. There's balsam root, which is actually out in the open a little bit more, and they'll also feed on some plants that flower later. So actually a lot of, it seems like some of the more yellow, like in that almost like sunflower family, those real yellow flowers, those tend to kind of blossom later. And there's a lot of nutrients in that as well. So, but you mentioned dandelions, that's still a good food source. And then, sometimes as you get later on, you might actually even see some early berries popping or even just those like buds of the berries as well.
Oh, okay.
It seems a little, it just depends on the year. Like depending on the winter, sometimes you'll start to see some of that stuff. Rose hips, rose buds, things like that starting to pop up in the creeks and other things. So that's another food source you can focus on.
Yeah. And as we're talking about this, I guess I'm thinking of like, kind of like those Western Rocky Mountain states as far as like a lot of the terrain, the mountains, and, just their spring bear seasons, like the Idahos, the Montanas, similar states like that as far as like, I guess the mental picture I'm drawing when we're talking about these tactics. What about, you kind of talked about like, hey, those bears, they're rutting, they're more on the move, trying to catch them going across an opening. Elevation-wise, is there anything going on there?
There can be, but I think more the elevation's a factor of like where you're going to find those good places for good glassing, right?
Okay.
So it depends on the makeup of like where you're hunting. The rocky slopes are still good, like those big openings. Anything that's attracting, like the females are still going to be feeding. in as much as they can. Like it's just like any other species. Like the males are super aggressive when it comes to rutting, but the females are just kind of doing their thing. So you can almost just say like, okay, I'm going to pinpoint sows of like where would they be, and then watch those areas for traveling boars. I mean, there's been one area where I've watched a sow walk through a meadow, and then another boar walk through, and then a boar walk through, and 3 boars walk through that same opening, just on the trail of a sow that walked through 30 minutes earlier.
Wild. I've never, I guess, had the opportunity to spend like a ton of time in the spring bear woods. I mean, I've hunted spring bears several times, but it's always like, well, this is the week that I picked. Like, it's going to be just how it is, right?
Yeah.
If a person has been maybe hunting fairly consistently and they've been seeing some sows and maybe not a boar that they want to try and take, is that intel that they should like almost like stick with that area? Like, hey, there's a sow in that area. This is a good spot for me to be for a boar to eventually move in.
For the most part, it is. The other thing though is like maybe that sow is just trying to avoid boars. Like, I don't know, but for the most part, yeah, it is. And we did talk about food sources, but I didn't mention the primary food source that I'm focusing on that time of year would be calves and fawns. So,
Okay.
I actually focus primarily on, when I'm looking for food sources, those fawning areas and those calving areas late in the season, because most of them are dropping. They're on the ground. Those areas smell. Bears are frequently checking those areas. It's the easiest meal. And I actually like to target bears that are targeting deer and elk. So it's kind of a double bonus, right?
It's kind of like a double dip there.
Yeah, a little double dip. You get to save a deer, save an elk. For later in the season, next year maybe, and be hunting bears as well. And by focusing on those areas, those are also a lot of areas that are more open and really good for glassing, and good areas to catch moving bears.
Okay, cool. That was going to be my next question, is kind of what would identify to you like, oh, this is a likely fawning or calving area?
Yeah, I mean, it's just like really a density of elk and deer.
Okay.
And, generally there's a lot of south-facing slopes, a lot of grass, but also nearby timber. Where they can kind of hide and get away and hide those fawns. But they also do like to group up and use that as defense. There's been many times where I've watched a group of elk, and here comes a bear, and the elk will go chase the bear off. And that bear's just like looking for a fawn or a calf that's just been kind of left alone.
Okay, gotcha. Do you take water into consideration at all?
Yeah, water is a huge factor. I think people underestimate how big a water source gets hit when it gets hot.
Okay.
I've actually set up trail cameras on water, just scouting for seeing where maybe elk and deer are moving through, and figured out, man, when it's a hot day, bears are wallowing like crazy. So that's just something to think about on those real hot days. Focus on water.
That's super cool. I know when I've hunted spring bears, the ticks can be off the charts.
Yep.
Does that progressively get worse or better as the season goes on?
Progressively gets better, in my opinion.
Okay.
Depends on the year, though.
I might have to start hunting the late
Yeah. Depends on the year and where you're at.
It gets warmer.
Does
right?
get warmer.
We're just talking about,
Yep.
Hey, they need water when it's hot. Will the bears still be active? Oh, the bears might be active later, and we'll see how the day goes. Are the bears still active in the heat?
Oh yeah. It's one of those things, like, you think, oh, it's too hot, it's the middle of the day, but they do move to water in the middle of the day a lot.
Okay.
And surprisingly, you think I've hunted bears for a long time. You think you got them figured, and then they show you don't. Late in the season, I've found a lot of bears in the middle of the day, in the heat of the day, out in the sun, just baking. And you're like, why?
Yeah.
I don't know.
How are you not insanely uncomfortable?
I always I like to think like, oh, it's too hot, they won't be out. And then I look up and I'm like, oh, there's a bear at noon in the baking sun in the middle of a burn, just hanging out, doing bear things. Like, he doesn't know. Maybe probably just wallowed a little bit. They'll get hot, they'll move to water, they'll roll around, splash in a creek.
I just went
go
for a
back
swim.
out. Yeah, go for a swim.
Feels good to
Eat
get
a little
back out in
bit.
the sun after that.
Eat a little bit and then go lay down. And I think part of the thing is just kind of understanding what the bear where you're at, what the bears where you're at are doing, and then focus on that. Because sometimes you'll be hunting and maybe they come out in the mornings, and that's like the most effective time. But for the most part, I prefer, if I had to pick, like you're like saying, okay, you got to hunt a half of the day. I'd rather hunt noon to dark than sunlight to noon. But it just depends. Sometimes it stays cooler longer too in the morning, so that's something to think about depending on what the temperature is doing.
Okay, sure. That is something to think about. And I guess, if you're maybe out for a week and you're primarily hunting, one side of the day, because, they are extremely long days,
Yeah.
right? It's tough to hunt just like daylight to dark that time of year, but maybe mix it up. I know, you hear, or at least I've always heard, like, oh, like you said, hunt the back half of that day, but I had a buddy that he's like, yeah, that's because nobody hunts the morning, and he hunts the mornings all the time and like shoots bears in the morning. I mean, so it's like,
for me, it's split. It's sixes. It's just when you're out, it's when you're gonna find them.
Yeah, I think you're right there. But I do think I do agree. Like I think primarily if you're gonna pick that noon to dark is gonna be your ticket to success, and then like I said, it makes it when you're hunting, noon to 10 p.m. and then you get back to ish or whatever it is, and you finally get something to eat and go to bed.
It's midnight.
Yeah. But did we miss anything? Did we miss any late season spring bear tactics that might help somebody finally punch that tag?
I think that covers it. I think with those tactics, you're well on your way to being a spring bear success story.
There you go, everybody. You are armed and dangerous with your late season spring bear tactics. Hit the field. Go try and get a bear for the freezer.
Yeah, perfect.
Thanks, everybody, for listening. Remi, thank you so much for all of your knowledge.
Yeah.
We'll catch you on the next one.